I scooched low to keep my balance as I made my way down the steep path from the woods onto the beach. Snoopy, our old lab mix, scrambled down behind me. Feet now resting on the sand, I looked around and took in a big breath of sea air. It was a beach I knew well, its branches of driftwood and dried seaweed, bodies of horseshoe crabs, bits of bright yellow shooting skeets, small holes in the wet sand, telltale signs of clams below who would occasionally spit shoots of water into the air. I came here to observe and listen, to commune with the gulls and the grasses, simply to be. Suddenly, I was jolted out of my memory by the voice of my teacher. So, what happened? The memory of being on my beloved beach was part of an exercise in my spiritual director training some years ago. Our teacher was leading us in a guided meditation to pinpoint the moment when we lost touch with our souls. We are all, he suggested, able to hear the call of our souls as children, and then we inevitably lose touch with it as society forces us into new ways of being until we stop hearing it altogether. He guided us in our imaginations to a time in childhood when we felt most alive and most ourselves. And suddenly he said, "So what happened?" It was the first time in my life that it had become so crystal clear. What happened was that my family moved from our home in a small town in Maine to a Detroit suburb when I was 13. 13 is a difficult age in the best of circumstances, but throw in the added challenge of moving to an entirely new place, a whole new culture essentially, and bad things are bound to happen. This new place felt like a different planet. Gone were the woods and the beach. Gone were the outdoor ramblings, the childhood games with the few kids in my neighborhood, the exploration of the pond and creek just steps from my house. Now I saw nothing but big houses and Tony shops, and just 2 miles down the road, the shock of poverty as one crossed into Detroit. A victim of bullying, I was lonely and isolated. But gradually, I learned to make myself fit in just enough to not be noticed. At some point, I realize now, I stopped having to try so hard, and it just became my new way of being. I had been shaped into almost a new person, one who could survive in this strange new wilderness. Now, of course, I would have lost my childhood innocence eventually, and in fact, I think I held on to it longer than most. I was blessed with a safe and comfortable childhood. But even in the earlier years, I was receiving messages that I needed to hide some of the weirder parts of myself in order to be acceptable. But that move is what accelerated the process dramatically. That move, for me, is what happened. Cultures and traditions across time and place have taught that we each come into this world embodying this soul, and that as we grow, the influences around us force us to adopt personas, don masks that will protect us, assist us in fitting in or staying safe, help us to be liked and loved and accepted. The more we build that persona, the further we drift from the soul until we're completely disconnected from it. It's there somewhere under layers of self-protection. It's necessary for us to build this persona to a degree, as it's what helps us function in our day-to-day lives. It's what helps us get to our appointments, do our jobs, and keep a household running. And yes, for some of us, it's what keeps us safe. But there inevitably comes a point when we've become too much of this person, that we're living a life that's not really our own. We're living what the Quaker teacher and writer Parker Palmer calls a divided life, one in which there's a distinct gap between who we are and the face we put to the world. We don't hear that still, small voice, as it's called in the Book of Kings in the Hebrew Bible. Going back millennia, beliefs about the soul have been rich and varied. For our purposes this morning, I'm going to speak about the soul as the most authentic self, that which our first Unitarian Universalist principle refers to as our inherent worth and dignity. As Unitarian Universalists, we are called on to recognize and honor that inherent worth, that inherent spark that connects us with all living things. Part of that call is to honor the inherent worth and goodness within ourselves, the inherent beauty, gifts, self, soul. In his beautiful sermon a couple of weeks ago, the Reverend Stan Barrett looked at this authentic self through the eyes of the Sufi mystic Rumi when he shared with us the call to come to the root of yourself. Stan said, and I quote, "And in case the invitation needs strengthening, we're enticed with one hint after another of what self of ourself might be. You are a ruby embedded in granite, a guard at the treasury of holy light. You are born from a ray of God's majesty, a talisman protecting the treasure, but also the mine, where the gems are found and from which they're dug." In the spiritual order which received its impetus from Rumi's life, this deepest reality, this original self, is often referred to as one's secret. A parallel image in Zen Buddhism is your face before you were born. The Jewish and Christian traditions see the human as the bearer of the divine image. End quote. It is that which this morning I refer to as the soul. Parker Palmer offers a different metaphor for the soul. The soul is like a wild animal, he writes in his book, Let Your Life Speak. The soul is like a wild animal, tough, resilient, savvy, self-sufficient, and yet exceedingly shy. If we want to see a wild animal, the last thing we should do is go crashing through the woods, shouting for the creature to come out. But if we are willing to walk quietly into the woods and sit silently for an hour or two at the base of a tree, the creature we are waiting for may well emerge. And out of the corner of an eye, we will catch a glimpse of the precious wildness we seek. For myself, I like to think of the soul as a friend, a loved one, a beloved, something, someone I am in relationship with. It is shy, as Parker Palmer says, yes. It, she, he, they, it stays largely hidden, as a very unmeddling friend might, or a wise old auntie. But it is there for guidance and to serve as my North Star. She's the wisest of friends, with answers to all of my questions about life. But we meet only for moments at a time. We don't vacation together. We hardly even join each other for a meal. Some traditions teach that our souls hold our life's purpose. Plato suggested that we're born at this particular place and time to fulfill a particular purpose. The soul, or in his terminology, the daemon, acting as a carrier of our destiny. Today, this idea is still promoted by writers, religionists, and philosophers. In his best-selling book, The Soul's Code, Jungian scholar James Hillman presents his acorn theory, that the soul carries within it the image of a person's destiny, as an acorn carries the future of an oak tree. This theory holds some appeal to me, I admit. To think that I might be here for a singular purpose is rather interesting. But I think there's a danger in putting too much stock into it. For my entire adult life, up until maybe 9 or 10 months ago, I was convinced that my highest calling in this life was to be a writer. I believed it because it was a passion from when I was very young, and I believed it because I had some talent for it, and I think I believed it because I'd had a modicum of success in the popular sense with a few pieces I've written. Looking back now, there was nothing about the way I lived my life that indicated that this was truly a calling. But I had convinced myself so surely that this was what I was put on earth for that I constantly felt guilty during the long, and I mean very long, stretches of time when I wasn't doing any writing. And when I was writing, I was putting pressure on myself to make sure that it was good, that it was worthy of a call. It was only recently that I began to see the truth of it. I simply like to write. It was actually a very painful loss, this loss of an identity that I never actually embodied. But as the months have passed, it's also been freeing. I can write when I want to for the sheer joy it brings. The term calling in our culture is typically reserved for the realm of vocation or for our life's purpose. But what if we began to think of the soul's calling not as lofty as all that, but what if we began to see it simply as the soul calling out to us, calling attention to itself, much like we might call out when we walk into a relative's home. Hello, I'm here. What if we begin to think of our soul's callings as a call back to our authentic self, calling us back home? When we shift our mindset, we understand that our days are filled with callings. In addition to my work here at the church, I work as a spiritual director. The title spiritual director is a bit of a misnomer because there is no directing involved. Quite the contrary, the purpose of spiritual direction is to create space to allow one to hear that wise inner voice, to hear that call of the soul. If someone wants to address a problem or a challenge in spiritual direction, a spiritual director would never offer an opinion or advice, because we can't possibly know what is right for another person. The spiritual director simply asks questions to help the person go deeper. We all have the answers to how best to live our lives. Those answers live in our souls. But we can't always access them because we're distracted. We're utilizing too much energy in maintaining a particular persona. We're afraid. We're surrounded by noise. In his book, Callings, Finding and Following an Authentic Life, Greg Lavoie writes about hearing the call of our soul. Any practice that strengthens our powers of observation, he writes, and our ability to see subtleties within ourselves, any practice that allows us to step outside and look back through the shop window will help us awaken. These practices include anything that helps us pay attention to our lives, gently sanding our fingertips to make them more sensitive to the feel of things, such as a daily journal, meditation, artwork, movement, dream interpretation, music, long walks, intimate conversation, rituals. These practices also remind us not to spend so much time awaiting big, booming voices from on high that we stumble over the whispers that are right at our feet. The whispers that are right at our feet. These are the subtle callings that we so often miss because we don't pause to notice what's happening interiorly. we're not able to get out of our heads. Because we cannot hear the callings from our heads. Spiritual practices that take us more into our bodies, or that take us out of time and place, as the voice suggests, improve our chances of hearing the callings. Logic and reason and intellect are wonderful gifts, but they are not the way of the soul. Our souls speak to us rather through our imaginations, through art and music and poetry. They speak to us through our bodies, in the form of tears and chills, for example, through symbols and metaphors that come to us in dreams, through the person who inexplicably pops into our mind, or the small incident that feels oddly meaningful, the overheard snippet of conversation that seems to ring loud and clear. Our souls speak to us when we stop and pause, when we notice. My own soul meets me in those moments when I'm feeling fully alive, as I did on the beach in my childhood. She meets me when I feel a tug, when my eyes tear up, when I get a chill. I can sometimes meet her intentionally in quiet moments, in nature, but sometimes she catches me unawares. She was there with me the other week in the 9/11 Museum in New York City, as I took in the larger-than-life photos of people on the streets with expressions of deep anguish and horror as they watched the Twin Towers. I hear brief whispers from her when I'm suddenly struck by how blessed I am when my family is gathered. These are glimmers, whispers. "Hello, I'm here," she says. "Remember me, the one who knows exactly who you are." One day, you finally knew what you had to do, the poet writes. It was already late enough, and a wild night, and the road full of fallen branches and stones. But little by little, as you left their voice behind, the stars began to burn through the clouds, and there was a new voice, which you slowly recognized as your own, that kept you company as you strode deeper and deeper into the world. May we be ever open to hearing the call of the soul, the voice that is our very own, calling from deep within, calling us home.